myself Srija. Today you are going to learn about the anatomy and physiology of trachea, bronchi and bronchioles. So coming to the first part, it's a trachea. Trachea is also called as windpipe. So what is trachea? It's an important part of our respiratory system. So it's the main airway that connects the larynx to the bronchi, the two branches that lead into the lungs. So trachea, it's a flexible tubular structure. It acts as a passage for air to move in and out of the lungs. It's about 10 to 12 centimeter long and around 2 centimeter diameter in adults. So what is the function of trachea? The main function of trachea is to conduct air, to carry oxygen from the nose and mouth down to the lungs, and to carry carbon dioxide out during exhalation. So what do you mean by exhalation? Exhaling the carbon dioxide out of the body. Inhalation, inhaling of oxygen into the body. So this trachea, it also ensures that this airway remains open at all times because of its special structure. So at the right side, you can see the picture of trachea. Larynx, this larynx is at the top. So this larynx, it connects the mouth and nose region to the trachea. So next to trachea, in between, the middle part is called as trachea. It's made up of C-shaped cartilage rings, which are also called as tracheal cartilages. So why are they called as tracheal cartilages? Because they are present in trachea. The C-shaped cartilage rings are present in trachea. So the name itself is called as tracheal cartilages. So what does these rings do? These rings keep the airway open and it prevents the collapse of the opening. So the open part of the C, it faces the esophagus, so it can expand when swallowing. This trachea, it can end by dividing into two primary bronchi. You can see in the picture, it can be divided into two primary bronchi, one for each lung. So the point where the trachea divides into the primary bronchi, it is called as carina. This carina is very sensitive and triggers a cough reflex when anything enters the wrong way. You can see the carina, it's a middle in between trachea and the point where it divides into bronchi. So it is called as carina. So besides carrying the air, this trachea also helps to filter the air using mucus and cilia. So what are cilia? They are the tiny hair-like structures, right? So they are the tiny hair-like structures. So these can help to filter the air. This trachea, it also moisten and warm the air before it reaches the lungs. So these functions help to protect the respiratory system from dust, germs, and also the cold air. So what would happen if the trachea didn't have cartilage rings? So what is the main role of these cartilage rings? To prevent from the collapse, right? So what would happen if the trachea didn't have these cartilage rings? It would collapse. It could block the complete airflow. So air couldn't pass through, right? So why this trachea is called as windpipe? Because it carries the flow of air like wind in and out of the lungs. So it is called as windpipe. So in the next slide, now we are going to learn about anatomy of the trachea. So what is the starting point of trachea? Where it starts? So this trachea, it begins at the lower border of the cricoid cartilage, so which is the part of larynx. You can see over the picture, the trachea begins at the lower border of the cartilage, which is part of a larynx. So this level, it corresponds to the C6 vertebrae in the neck. So next to larynx, you can find the C6 vertebrae in neck. So from there, it extends into the chest until above the fifth thoracic vertebrae, T5 level. So at this point, at this T5 level, this trachea divides into right and left thoracic vertebrae. So right and left primary bronchi. So one going into each lung. So this division, it occurs at a small ridge inside called as carina. So what is the position of the trachea in the body? It lies in the front of the esophagus and it lies behind the sternum and above the bronchi where it branches into two. So this position allows air to pass easily to both lungs while staying protected behind the chest bone. So coming to the structure of the tracheal wall. Tracheal wall, actually the wall of trachea is made up of four main layers. You can clearly see the layers in the diagram. What are they? Mucosa, the innermost layer, submucosa, the second layer, cartilaginous layer behind the submucosa, and the adventitia, so outer layer. Adventitia is a outer layer. So coming to the first layer, this is the innermost lining of the trachea, directly in contact with the air we breathe. So what does this mucosa made up of? It is made up of pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which is also called as respiratory epithelium. So this cilia, mucosa, it contains of cilia. So this cilia is a tiny hair-like structures. They move rhythmically to push mucus and trapped dust particles upward towards the throat. So what does this helps? It helps to clean the airway. So you can think of this layer as a cleaning belt of the trachea. So mucosa, we can think about of this mucosa is what? It's a cleaning belt of the trachea. It keeps the airway clear of dust and germs. So coming to the second layer, submucosa. So what is submucosa? Is a layer just beneath the mucosa. It contains connective tissue, seromucous glands, blood vessels, and also the nerves. The seromucous glands, what are these glands? These glands, it produces mucus that keeps the airway moist and also help to trap the particles. So the blood vessels help warm the air before it enters the lungs. So submucosa is like a support layer that nourishes and protects the inner lining. So coming to the cartilaginous layer, it's a blue ringed layer labeled over here. This layer, it provides strength and structure to the trachea. So what it is made up of? 60 to 20 C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage. So these rings keep the trachea open at all the times. So these rings, the blue color, the region, you can find the rings in black and white color. So these rings, they open at all the times. They prevent from collapsing during the breathing. So these rings, what they will do? They will prevent the trachea from collapsing at the time of the breathing. So if trachea get collapsed, you cannot breathe, right? So this cartilaginous ring plays that role in preventing the trachea to collapse. So why do you think the cartilage rings are C-shaped and not complete circles? So why do you think? Because C-shaped, it is easy to allow flexibility for swallowing. So the outer layer, adventitia, it's outer layer. This is the outer covering of the trachea. So mucosa is the innermost, whereas adventitia is the outermost. So it consists of a connective tissue that anchors the trachea to nearby structures in the neck and chest. So it contains the trachealis muscle at the back, which helps to adjust the diameter of the trachea during the breathing and coughing. Did you get my point? During breathing and coughing, so when do you do breathe and cough, what does this outer layer of trachea do? It adjusts the diameter, right? So it adjusts the diameter so that you can flexibly breathe and cough. So this adventitia, it acts like a protective cover that holds everything together. So this is about the structure of the tracheal wall. So in the next layer, here histology, what it is? Microscopic structure of trachea. So when we look at trachea under the microscope, we can see that it is made up of different specialized tissues. Each of these tissues has an important role in protecting, supporting, and maintaining the airway. So coming to the first, what is epithelium? It is a pseudo stratified ciliated columnar epithelium. This is the inner lining of the trachea. It is also called as respiratory epithelium. It looks like it has many layers, but all these cells actually touch the basement membrane. It contains cilia, small hair-like projections that move in a wave-like manner to push mucus and the trapped particles upward toward the throat. So these cilia act like tiny brooms cleaning the air we breathe. So with the help of cilia present within the epithelium, it pushes, this trachea pushes the mucus and trapped particles upward towards the bone, right? Next, lamina propria. So it's a connective tissue layer beneath the epithelium. This supports the epithelial layer, and it also contains the elastic fibers, blood vessels, and immune cells which help to defend against the infection. So together with the epithelium, it forms the mucosa of the trachea. So think of the lamina propria as a foundation that nourishes and supports the upper layer. So glands. What are the glands? The ceremucous glands in the submucosa. What does this glands do? They traps the dust and microbes while the watery part keeps the air moist. So what does the seromucous glands do? Seromucous, the name itself, sero means water secretions and mucus means mucus. So this gland produces mucus and water secretions. This mucus, it traps dust and microbes while the watery part keeps the air moist. So they are found in the submucosa layer just below the mucosa. So last, cartilage, hyaline cartilage rings. So what are these rings? These are the C-shaped cartilage rings. So this give the trachea its shape and rigidity. So cartilage rings are important because they gives the trachea shape and rigidity. They also prevent the trachea from collapsing when air moves in and out. So the open part of the C-shaped cartilage ring, it faces backward towards the esophagus. So why do you think the cartilage rings are not complete cycles? Because a C-shaped cartilage rings, it allow the flexibility when swallowing the food. So muscle, coming to the muscle, it's a smooth muscle or trachealis muscle. So this muscle is located at the back of the trachea where the cartilage ring is open. It can contract or relax to change the diameter of the trachea. So what happens to the muscle during coughing? During coughing, it contracts to make the airway narrower so that this increases the air pressure to help expel mucus or foreign particles. So this is about the layers of the trachea. So what are the functions of the trachea? The trachea performs several vital respiratory and protective functions that helps to keep the lungs safe and ensure the smooth breathing. So let's go through each one of them. What is the first one? Air conduction. So what is air conduction? It is a passageway for air to move in and out of the lungs. So what is the main function of trachea? Its the main function of trachea is to conduct air between the larynx and bronchi. So it acts as a passageway for air to move in and out of the lungs. This C-shaped cartilage rings keep it open all the time so air can flow freely during both exhalation and inhalation. So trachea is like the main highway that carries air down to the lungs. So coming to the second function, filtration and cleaning of air. So the inner layer of the trachea has cilia and also the mucus secreting cells. So what does this mucus do? This mucus traps dust, germs and other foreign particles from the air. So the cilia, what does cilia do? The cilia, it beats upward towards, push the mucus towards the throat where it can be swallowed or expelled. So what happens if dust gets into your trachea? What happens? So it gets trapped and removed by mucus, right? So what is the third function? Humidification and warming of air. So as air passes through the trachea, it becomes moistened and warmed by the blood vessels and glands in the tracheal wall. So this ensures that the air reaching the lungs is not too dry or cold. So what does they do? Protect the delicate lung tissues. So the trachea acts like a conditioner here. It warms and humidifies the air before it enters the lungs. So what is cough reflex? The carina, the point where as I showed you in before slide, you do have a picture of carina. So this carina is what? It's a point where the trachea divides into bronchi, right? So this part is very sensitive. As I told you, this part is very sensitive. So if any particle or if any foreign particle touches it, so it can trigger a cough reflex. So this forcefully expels air to remove the irritant from the airway. So the carina is like a guard. It immediately reacts if anything unwanted enters the airway. And the fifth function is support during swallowing. The C-shaped cartilage rings, they provide support but also the flexibility. So the open part of the C, it faces the esophagus, allowing it to expand when you swallow the food. So this prevents the trachea from collapsing while allowing normal swallowing. The trachea and esophagus share space, so the trachea's flexible rings make swallowing safe. So the last function, the sixth function of trachea. The trachea divides into right and left primary bronchi which enter the lungs. So this branching ensures that air is evenly distributed to both the lungs. It forms the upper part of the lower respiratory tract. So this is all about trachea. Now we will learn about bronchi and bronchioles. So what is bronchi? After air passes through the trachea, it doesn't go directly into the lungs. So what does it do in between? It travels through a network of branching air tubes called bronchi and bronchioles. So these tubes, it form the lower connecting part of a respiratory system. So coming to the structure of bronchi. So the trachea divides into two large branches called primary bronchi. So into two main branches, primary bronchi, the right main bronchus, it goes to the right lung, and the left main bronchus, it goes to the left lung. So each bronchus then divides further into smaller branches. So the secondary bronchi, each one supplies a lobe of the lung, whereas tertiary bronchi, it supplies smaller segments within each lobe. So these keep branching into smaller bronchi and finally into bronchioles at the tiniest air passages. Yeah, you are seeing the picture of the bronchi and bronchioles at the right side. So the air has passed through the trachea. It reaches a point where the trachea splits into two main tubes. These are called as primary bronchi. So let's look closely at how these airways are organized. So first, primary or main bronchi. The trachea divides at a ridge called the carina, located roughly at the T5 vertebral level into two branches. So what is the right main bronchus and left main bronchus? Right main bronchus. It is wider, shorter and more vertical, about 2.5 centimeter long. Because it is more vertical, foreign objects like food or small particles are more likely to enter the right lung if accidentally inhaled. So what does it happens after inhaling? It goes directly into the right lung and it divides into three branches for the three lobes of the right lung. So what is left main bronchus? It is narrower, longer and more horizontal, about 5 centimeter long. So it passes under the arch of the aorta before entering the left lung. So this divides into two branches corresponding to the two lobes of the left lung. So which bronchus is more likely to get a peanut stuck in it? The right main bronchus, because it's wider and more vertical. Here you can see right mainstem bronchus, left mainstem bronchus, bronchi, bronchioles, trachea, right lobes, left lobes, and the pleura, a protective membrane around the lungs, pleural fluid, the diaphragm, and the alveola. So each main bronchus divides again into secondary lobar bronchi. So each supplying one lobe of the lung. So right lung you have three lobes, whereas left lung you have two lobes. So this bronchi then further divide into tertiary bronchi that go into smaller lung segments and also finally into bronchioles. So the trachea splitting into right and left main bronchi. How each bronchus branches inside the lungs to reach different lobes. The alveoli at the very end where gas exchange happens. So what did you learn from this slide, guys? The trachea divides into two main bronchi at the carina or T5 level. The right bronchus is a short, wide, vertical, enters right lung, whereas left bronchus, it is a long, narrow, horizontal. It enters into the left lung, which has two lobes. So think of the trachea as the main highway. So trachea is the main highway. This is the main highway. The right and left bronchi. This is the right and this is the left bronchi. So these are two big roads leading into each lung. So inside each lung, these roads branch into smaller streets and also even the smaller ones. So smaller bronchi. This smaller bronchi, it is repeatedly inside the lungs. The airways become smaller and more numerous. So the cartilage rings, which were large and regular in the main bronchi, it becomes smaller and irregular in the smaller bronchi. So this gradual reduction in cartilage, it helps the airway remain flexible but still open for the airway. So think of the bronchial tree like a real tree. The main bronchi are the thick branches near the trunk, and as they move outward, so the branches get thinner and more flexible. So coming to the bronchioles. Bronchioles are the smallest airways in the conducting zone of the respiratory tract. So these are less than 1 millimeter in diameter and are formed by further branching of the tertiary bronchi. So unlike the larger bronchi, bronchioles do not have cartilage or glands. So instead they have smooth muscles or smooth muscle walls that help to regulate airflow by contracting or relaxing. So the smooth muscle is important, right? So the smooth muscle contract is important because it allows the bronchioles to constrict or dilate depending on the body's needs. So during exercise, bronchioles dilate to allow more air in. In asthma, they constrict, making breathing difficult. So what is the bronchial tree? Trachea, main bronchi, lobar bronchi, segmental bronchi, smaller bronchi, bronchioles and alveolar. So these are the functions of bronchi and bronchioles: air conduction, filtration and defense, regulation of airflow, humidification and warming of air, gas exchange, initiation. So what is the first function? Air conduction. So what is air conduction? The main function of bronchi and bronchioles. It is to carry air from the trachea to the deeper parts of the lungs and back out again. So they act as passageways like air tunnels, ensuring oxygen reaches the alveoli where gas exchange happens and also the carbon dioxide is carried out. So when do you think this bronchi and bronchioles as highways? So these highways deliver the oxygen and remove the carbon dioxide efficiently. So coming to the filtration and defense, it is inner lining of the bronchi contains mucus producing cells, right? So the inner lining of bronchi, it contains the mucus producing cells, and these cells, this inner lining, you do have a tiny hair-like structures called cilia. So what does the cilia do? They trap dust, microorganisms and other particles that enter with the inhaled air. So the cilia, it sweep mucus upward toward the throat where it can be coughed out or swallowed. So this is called as mucociliary escalator. So this helps to protect the lungs from infection and also it keeps the airways clean. So the third function is regulation of airflow. So what is regulation of airflow? This bronchioles, it contains smooth vessels that can contract or relax. So when it contracts, it gets narrowed. When it relaxes, it gets widened. So this controls the amount of air entering different parts of the lung. So what are the examples of this regulation of airflow? This controls the amount of air entering different parts of the lung. So what examples? During exercise, bronchioles dilate to allow more air, whereas during asthma or allergic reaction, bronchioles constrict, making breathing difficult. So example, analogy. If you can compare these bronchioles to walls in the heart, you can also compare the walls in the lungs too. What does they do? They control how much air gets into the lungs, just like a tap controls the flow of water. So this is about the regulation of airflow. Now coming to the next function, it is humidification and warming of air. So as air passes through the bronchi and bronchioles, so it is warmed to the body temperature and gets moistened. So the lining of these airways, they contain mucus and blood vessels that help in warming and humidifying the air before it reaches the delicate alveoli. So what is the purpose of humidification and warming of air? They prevents the dryness and irritation in the alveoli, and also it keeps gas exchange efficient. So the final function of bronchi and bronchioles is gas exchange initiation. What do you mean by it? Here the gas exchange takes place. In what parts the gas exchange takes place? The respiratory bronchioles are the first parts of the airway where gas exchange begins. So their walls have small alveolar sacs where oxygen enters the blood and carbon dioxide leave the blood. So while the larger bronchi and smaller bronchioles only conduct air, the respiratory bronchioles are the first to actually start gas exchange. So these are the functions of the bronchi and bronchioles. So this is all about today's session. In tomorrow's session, you will be learning about the alveoli and lungs, which are the other parts of respiratory system. Thank you.